The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 304, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge William Hartley sat behind his massive oak desk, his silver-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose as he shuffled through the day's cases. At 62 years old, he had spent the last 15 years building a reputation as one of the strictest judges in the county courthouse. The clock on the wall showed 9:15 a.m. when Sarah Jenkins walked into the courtroom. She wore a simple navy blue blazer and matching skirt, her gray streaked hair pulled back neatly in a bun. At 55 years old, Sarah carried herself with quiet confidence, though few in the courtroom that day would notice. Case number 2347, parking violation on Madison Street, announced the court clerk, her voice echoing through the half-empty room. Judge Hartley didn't even look up from his papers. He had seen thousands of cases like this before, and in his mind, this would be no different. The ticket showed the car had been parked in a loading zone for over 2 hours, resulting in a $500 fine. "Step forward," Judge Hartley commanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority he had perfected over the years. He still hadn't looked up to see who stood before him. Sarah moved forward, her sensible black shoes making soft sounds on the wooden floor. She stood straight, hands clasped in front of her, waiting patiently to be addressed properly. "Do you understand why you're here today?" Judge Hartley asked, his tone suggesting he was already bored with the proceedings. He began his familiar lecture, one he had given countless times before. Parking regulations exist for a reason. Loading zones are essential for local businesses. Your disregard for these rules shows a lack of respect for our community's laws. The judge finally glanced up, his eyes quickly scanning Sarah's appearance. His assumption-filled mind immediately categorized her, another person who would probably ask for a payment plan or plead hardship. He had seen it all before. "How do you plead to the charge of illegal parking in a loading zone on March 15th, between 10 a.m. and 12:30 p.m.? He asked, his tone making it clear he expected either an excuse or a plea for leniency. The other people in the courtroom, a handful of lawyers waiting for their cases, a couple of courthouse regulars, and the usual staff, barely paid attention. This was routine, after all. Just another morning in traffic court. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but Judge Hartley cut her off. "Before you answer, let me remind you that camera evidence clearly shows your vehicle remained in the loading zone for 2 hours and 30 minutes. That's well beyond any reasonable time for loading or unloading." He picked up a printed photograph from his desk, showing a silver Mercedes parked in front of a school building. "This is your vehicle, correct? License plate number XRJ2891. Sarah nodded calmly. "Yes, Your Honor, that is my car." "Well then," Judge Hartley continued, settling back in his chair, "given the clear evidence and the length of time involved, the fine stands at $500. Will you need a payment plan?" His tone carried the assumption that she would. The courtroom remained quiet, the morning sun now fully streaming through the windows. A young intern rushed in through the back door, carrying a stack of files, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor, the only interruption to the tense silence. Sarah stood there, her expression unchanged, dignity intact. She had experienced moments like this throughout her life. Moments when people made assumptions based on nothing more than a quick glance and their own preconceptions. The judge's secretary slipped him a note, but he waved it away, focused on wrapping up what he considered a routine case. "Ms. Jenkins, we're waiting for your response. How do you plead, and do you require a payment plan for the fine?" Little did Judge William Hartley know that this seemingly ordinary Monday morning was about to become one of the most significant moments in his 15-year career on the bench. The woman standing before him was far from what he had assumed, and the next few minutes would challenge everything he thought he knew about making snap judgments. "Your Honor." Sarah Jenkins spoke with a clear, steady voice that carried naturally through the courtroom. "I plead guilty to the parking violation." She paused, noticing how Judge Hartley's eyebrows lifted slightly at her directness. He had expected excuses, perhaps even tears, but not this straightforward admission. The judge leaned forward, his reading glasses sliding further down his nose. "Well, that's refreshing," he said, though his tone suggested he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. In his experience, a guilty plea was usually followed by a lengthy explanation or a plea for mercy. However, he continued, settling into his familiar lecture mode, "I hope you understand the seriousness of this violation. Loading zones are not intended for extended parking. Local businesses depend on these spaces for their deliveries. He picked up his gavel, ready to pronounce the fine and move on to his next case. Sarah remained perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The morning sunlight caught the simple pearl necklace at her throat, and for a moment, it gleamed brilliantly. A few other people waiting in the courtroom had started paying attention, sensing something different about this interaction. "Miss Jenkins," Judge Hartley's voice took on a condescending tone, "I assume you're familiar with the concept of payment plans, given the size of the fine." "Your Honor," Sarah interrupted politely but firmly, something rarely done in his courtroom. "I don't need a payment plan." The judge's face darkened at the interruption. "Ms. Jenkins, in my courtroom, we observe proper." "I apologize for interrupting, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm and dignified. "But I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not here to dispute the fine or request special treatment. I'm here because I respect the law and this court." A young lawyer sitting in the back straightened up, his interest piqued by the unusual exchange. The court clerk had even stopped shuffling her papers, her eyes moving between the judge and the woman standing before him. Judge Hartley removed his glasses, a habit he had when his patience was wearing thin. "Ms. Jenkins, while I appreciate your respect for the court, the fact remains that you violated the loading zone regulation outside Carter Elementary School." Sarah completed his sentence. "Yes, I did. And I'm prepared to pay the fine in full right now." She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a checkbook bound in soft leather. The judge's face showed the first signs of confusion. This wasn't following the script he was used to. His eyes narrowed as he studied Sarah more carefully for the first time since she'd entered his courtroom. "However," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a gentle but authoritative tone that made even the bailiff turn his head, "I believe it's important for the court to understand the context of this violation." Judge Hartley's hand tightened around his gavel. He disliked when defendants tried to justify their actions, but something in Sarah's demeanor made him hesitate before shutting her down. The morning sun had fully risen now, and the courtroom was bathed in warm light. Through the windows, they could hear the distant sound of children playing in the schoolyard across the street. "Miss Jenkins," the judge said, his voice carrying a warning tone, "context rarely changes the nature of a violation." Sarah smiled slightly, a gesture that carried no mockery, only understanding. "Sometimes, Your Honor, context changes everything." She stood straighter, and something in her bearing made Judge Hartley lean back slightly in his chair. "Would the court allow me to provide that context?" The young lawyer in the back had pulled out his phone, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The court clerk had completely abandoned any pretense of working on other tasks, her eyes fixed on the scene before her. Judge Hartley found himself at a crossroads. His usual approach would be to shut down any attempted explanations and move on with his docket, but something about Sarah Jenkins, perhaps her dignity, her calm confidence, or the way she carried herself, made him pause. Little did he know that his next decision would not only change the course of this seemingly routine traffic court session, but would also force him to confront his own deeply held prejudices and assumptions. After what seemed like an eternity, it was really only a few seconds. Judge Hartley nodded slowly. "Proceed, Ms. Jenkins," he said, his voice carrying less certainty than before. "The court will hear your context." Sarah Jenkins took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Judge Hartley's directly. "Your Honor, on March 15th, I was overseeing the delivery of 35 new computers to Carter Elementary School." She paused, noting how the judge's expression shifted slightly at the mention of the school. "These computers," she continued, "were part of a $500,000 technology grant from the Jenkins Foundation, which I established 15 years ago. The delivery took longer than expected because we were also setting up the school's first ever computer lab." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Hartley's hand, which had been reaching for his gavel, froze midair. He knew Carter Elementary well. His daughter Jennifer had been teaching 3rd grade there for the past 5 years. "The Jenkins Foundation?" he asked, his voice losing its earlier authority. "The same foundation that," he trailed off, remembering the excited phone call he received from Jennifer just 2 weeks ago about the new computer lab transforming her classroom. Sarah nodded, a gentle smile crossing her face. "Yes, Your Honor." The same foundation that has provided over $12 million in educational grants to underfunded schools in our district over the past decade. The young lawyer in the back was now frantically typing on his phone, his eyes widening as he pulled up the Jenkins Foundation website. The court clerk had stopped pretending to work entirely, her mouth slightly open in surprise. "I deliberately parked in the loading zone that day," Sarah explained, "because it was the closest access point to the school's main entrance. The computers were being delivered by volunteers, many of them senior citizens who give their time to our foundation. I wanted to minimize the distance they had to carry the equipment." Judge Hartley removed his glasses slowly, placing them on his desk with unusual care. His daughter had mentioned the volunteers, retired teachers and grandparents who had spent hours helping set up the new lab. "Ms. Jenkins," he said, his voice notably softer, "are you saying you're the Sarah Jenkins? The one who—" He paused again, memories flooding back of all the times Jennifer had mentioned the foundation's work. "I'm just someone who believes every child deserves access to modern education, Your Honor," Sarah replied modestly. "The loading zone violation was my responsibility, and I'm here to pay the fine. But I wanted you to understand that sometimes what looks like disregard for the law might actually be an attempt to serve the community in the best way possible." The morning sun now filled the courtroom completely, and Judge Hartley noticed for the first time the small foundation pin on Sarah's lapel, a simple design of an "She's the one who transformed our school. Did you meet her?" The judge placed his phone face down on his desk, his mind replaying the morning's events. For 15 years, he had prided himself on being firm but fair. Now he questioned how many times his fairness had been clouded by unconscious assumptions. The court clerk, Martha, knocked softly before entering his chambers. "Judge Hartley, I have some information you might want to see." She placed a folder on his desk, open to newspaper clippings about the Jenkins Foundation's work. "I did some research during lunch," Martha explained. "Last month, Ms. Jenkins donated her entire retirement fund, $3 million, to create scholarship programs for underprivileged students. She lives in a modest 2-bedroom apartment and drives that same Mercedes she's had for 10 years. The judge picked up one of the articles, reading about how Sarah had started her foundation after selling her successful software company. She had grown up in their city's poorest neighborhood, won a scholarship to MIT, and returned home determined to give others the same opportunities she had received. "There's more," Martha continued, her voice soft. "The day she got that parking ticket, one of the volunteer delivery men had a heart attack while carrying a computer. Ms. Jenkins stayed with him, called 911, and then finished delivering the computers herself. That's why she was parked there so long." Judge Hartley removed his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. The weight of his earlier behavior pressed heavily on his conscience. He thought about how quickly he had assumed Sarah would need a payment plan, how dismissively he had treated her before knowing who she was. "Your daughter's classroom," Martha added, "was specifically chosen for the first computers because Jennifer had been using her own laptop to teach students basic coding during lunch breaks." Ms. Jenkins heard about it and was impressed by her dedication. The judge stood up and walked to his window. From here, he could see children playing in the schoolyard during their lunch break. Some of them would be using those computers this afternoon, learning skills that might change their lives, all because Sarah Jenkins had parked in a loading zone. His phone buzzed again with another text from Jennifer. "Dad, Sarah Jenkins just visited our classroom. The kids love the new computers. She sat with little Marcus for 30 minutes, helping him with his math program. She's amazing." Martha cleared her throat gently. "Judge, there's something else you should know. The Jenkins Foundation has been trying to start a program providing free legal aid to low-income families. They've been looking for judges to..." College. The other students came from wealthy families with their new laptops and expensive clothes. Sarah worked in the university library between classes, saving every penny she could. "You don't look like a computer science major," a professor once told her during her freshman year. Sarah pinned that comment above her desk, using it as fuel to graduate at the top of her class 4 years later. After college, while her classmates chased high-paying jobs in Silicon Valley, Sarah returned to her hometown. She started her software company in a tiny rented office, developing educational programs for children. Many investors passed on her company, some not even bothering to read her business plan. A tech company run by a black woman from the inner city. One investor had laughed. "That's not where we put our money." 10 years later, that same investor offered to buy her company for $50 million. Sarah's educational software was being used in schools across the country. She sold the company, but not to him. She chose a buyer who shared her vision for educational equality. The day after the sale, Sarah walked through her old neighborhood. She saw children playing with broken toys, just as she had done. She passed her old apartment above Tony's corner store, now a boarded-up building. That evening, she established the Jenkins Foundation with $40 million of her own money. Education changed my life, she told the local newspaper in a rare interview. Every child deserves that same chance. The foundation's first project was rebuilding the local library where Sarah had spent countless hours as a child. Next came computer labs in schools, scholarship programs, and teacher training initiatives. Sarah worked quietly, avoiding publicity, focusing on results rather than recognition. Her simple lifestyle puzzled many. She lived in a modest apartment, drove an aging Mercedes she kept in perfect condition, and spent most of her time in schools, watching children discover the joy of learning. The only luxury she allowed herself was helping others. One day, while delivering computers to Carter Elementary, Sarah met Jennifer Hartley, a young teacher using her personal laptop to teach students basic coding during lunch break. Based solely on her appearance. I made assumptions about her ability to pay a fine, her reasons for being in court, and her character, all before she spoke a single apologize for my behavior yesterday. You taught this old judge a valuable lesson." Sarah smiled warmly. Judge Hartley, bias doesn't make you a bad person, Sarah explained to the attentive audience. But recognizing and addressing it makes you a better one. She nodded toward their rights and responsibilities in the justice system. Sarah and Judge Hartley co-taught some of the classes, showing students how two people from different backgrounds could work together for positive change. The parking ticket that started it all hung framed in Judge Hartley's office, next to a photograph of Sarah helping students in the Carter Elementary Computer Lab. It served as a daily mentoring young girls interested in funded jointly by the Jenkins Foundation and the court system. 1 year ago, Sarah addressed the crowd. I walked into this courthouse expecting just another day of dealing with assumptions and prejudice. Instead, I found an opportunity for transformation. Judge Hartley could have simply taken my fine and moved on. Instead, he chose to learn, to change, and to make a difference. Judge Hartley stood beside her, emotion visible in his eyes. And I found a teacher, he added, in someone I had wrongly judged. Sarah taught me that true justice begins with seeing the humanity in every person who enters our courts. As they left the ceremony, they passed by courtroom 304, where it had all begun. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, just as it had that morning 1 year ago. But now, the light fell on a very different courthouse, one where justice truly served all. Outside, Sarah's silver Mercedes was parked in the loading zone, but this time, there was a special permit on the dashboard, one that read Jenkins Hartley Community Service Vehicle. Some rules had changed, but more importantly, the way they were applied had transformed.